Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to come here this evening. I'm really excited to share some ideas and some concepts around a topic that's really important. So today, I don't want you to see me as like an expert coming here to preach at you or tell you many big and exciting things. I want you to see me as a facilitator of a conversation that we're going to have together. So let's start with introduction and overview. What is circularity? So essentially, a very simple, basic way for you to understand what circularity is the state or quality of being in the shape or form of a circle. Now that's really basic. That's like me talking to my 5-year-old. Literally, when you're thinking about circularity, you're thinking about something that exists in the form of a circle, right? So if you think about the sun, if you think about a circle, you know that it has a point and it goes round and it comes to that point again. So there are a couple of things I want you to take away with you when you're leaving today, or if you want to take notes. The first thing is thinking about circularity from the point of a circle, right? Something that goes in but must come back into that starting point, right? Now, why is this important? Why should we care? The reason why I put why should Africans care is because I get a lot of pushback. People always say to me, why are you always preaching about sustainability? Why are you always preaching about circularity? Africans are naturally circular. We already do these things. It's the white people, it's the West that have those problems. Why should Africans care? And so I always push back further and I say, well, on two fronts we should care. One, because it's a global world. Whatever is happening in the West is also happening here. It's affecting us. You talk to farmers and they'll tell you they are having lower yields. You go to Mali and people who are planting indigo will tell you that they're having drought, experiencing drought. You'll go to different parts of Nigeria and you'll see floods that you've never seen before. So you know that it's a problem that affects us as well. Global warming, all these concepts are things that are not foreign to us just because we're living in a different part of the world. The second reason is that, yes, and I'll share that in the next slide, yes, it is true that Africans are naturally sustainable. These are things that are inherent to us. But I'll ask a question in the fourth slide. Is this enough? For me, I think that just because you're good at something doesn't mean you should stop there. There's always room to create. There's always room to innovate. There's always room to desire more. So for me, I am not comfortable with the idea that Africans are just sustainable. I'm going to be comfortable there because even within the context of fashion design, there's still gaps, right? I've been having conversations with different designers about the concept of adire, the concept of ashoke, and those are two things that are big exports from a traditional perspective, right? And I might be jumping the gun here because I wanted to bring it up at some point later, but let me just throw it there just for food for thought. So with adire, for example, everybody loves adire, everyone uses adire. It's a traditional technique that has been there for a long time. The way that we started using the adire technique before was maybe done properly in the beginning with maybe more natural dyes. Things were done with more consciousness, right? But now when we do adire, we're using chemical dyes. We're not disposing of the water properly. We're throwing in the gutters. We're throwing it back into the seas. The chemicals are really toxic for the dyers as well, for their skin, for their fingers as they inhale. And this is adire that you see like literally everybody wearing. So it's an actual problem. And so for me, when we say that we're naturally sustainable, yes, the processes are better, they're smaller, they're more intricate, but we've adopted a different way of using our traditions, right? So for me, my idea is always to dial back a bit and examine the process and say, okay, well, if we're actually sustainable, where are the gaps? And how can we clean up the system? How can we think about, still with using adire, for example, as a technique, but thinking about dyes that are maybe not natural because it's not easy to scale, but maybe not chemical dyes, right? Maybe there's an in-between that we can use. Maybe there's the ways that we can dispose of the water so we're not throwing it in the gutters. Maybe there are ways that we can clean and recycle water because, again, water is a finite resource, right? So there are companies now that are actually trying to create dyeing solutions where you dye without water because that's something that we need to be thinking about. So that's another thing. Then you think about Ashoke, for example, something that we love, akwete, these are textiles that we've been using for a long time. But if you go to the market and you ask for cotton threads, do you realize that they actually don't know the difference between cotton and polyester? So polyester is made from plastic. If you go to the market and you want to bead the Ashokes now are so stiff. They're not like before when our parents used to wear them, where they were made in silk, they were soft, they were nice. If you ask any of your grandparents to bring out the Ashokes, it was much nicer. So now we're still using our traditional techniques, but we've basically replaced the threads, the ethos of our identity with plastic and other things. So for me, I'm like, okay, how do we get back to those traditional elements of design and begin to put the natural sources back into that? So again, for me, this is why I think, okay, we're already sustainable. Yes, we're already naturally, inherently circular, but there are gaps and there are ways that we can improve on our circularity. So the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, I think some of you may have received the resource book, is a huge resource that I follow when it comes to circularity. Everything about circularity is on there, so I really encourage you to go on the website and learn from them. But they, basically to buttress what I was saying earlier, they've said circular business models in the textile industry are by no means new in Africa. On the contrary, they're culturally embedded and often more advanced than in other contexts. Now, this is a very true and accurate statement. So, as I was saying, here in Africa, our processes are slower, more intentional. You look at Eki Kere's work, for example, you can see that it's work that's done by hand. You can look at Ebuka shoes, the brand Maliko, you can understand that it's something that's been meticulously done. These brands are not mass-produced. We reuse our items. Even on the road, you see these guys pushing. The other day, I saw someone selling peanuts on the road, and I was looking, this is something that we've grown up seeing, but I guess because I've been preparing for this, it was interesting to me to see that he was using old tomato tins to obviously dish the peanuts, for the customers. And he could have used anything, but he was reusing a tomato tin. So this is something that we do naturally. We don't even think about it. Smaller batch productions. I'm sure if there's any designer here, or even a lot of the designers that I've been working with in the fashion industry for the last 15 years, we don't produce 1,000 pieces, 2,000 pieces. We don't produce, $1 a day. We are conscious about how we produce, and we enjoy producing in small quantities. Obviously, it's from an infrastructural handicap perspective where our industry isn't as developed. So manufacturing is actually a problem, but because of those handicaps, we are sustainable, we are careful, we're conscious about how we produce. We're closer to artisanal processes. So, for example, what Eki Kere does, like with her jacket there, it's easier for her to do in Nigeria. Maybe if she was somewhere else in the world, it'll be hard for her to access the raffia and the banana fibers and the dyes. So again, we are closer and it's easier to access our natural resources. But for me, I'm asking, is this enough? It's a good place. It's an excellent place. We stand ahead when it comes to circularity compared to the global north, compared to the west, where they need to really start thinking about their processes much, much better and much quicker. But is it enough? That's the question I want you to ask yourselves as well today. So let's start with this idea of circularity. The current way that we produce in the industry now, right? In Africa, in the global north, in the west, is we take something, natural resources from the ground. We take from raw material to the actual fiber, right? Then we make a really nice product, or we make something that's functional or not. We use it. So we create a product, we give it to the customers, they use it, and they throw it away. This is 80% of how we produce now across the world, in every industry, right? We're currently creating to dispose. But we must understand that that's not the natural way of the world. That's not how we were created. That's not the way we were designed, what we were designed for. So obviously, because of the Industrial Revolution and the way that the world has evolved, this is where we are today. This process that I've just described is called linear, right? So when we're saying we're going from linear to circular, this is what we mean. So we're constantly designing without asking another really important question that I want you to either note or keep in your mind. What happens to this, whatever that is, this product, this idea, this service, at the end of its life? So at the moment, we're not really asking ourselves those questions, right? Generally, I'm not speaking generally. When I'm saying we, I'm speaking generally. We're not really asking ourselves those key questions. What happens to a product at the end of its life? That's a very important question. So now we're going into, we've kind of discussed what linear is. We're going back into this idea of what a circular economy is, what circularity is, right? In contrast to what linear economy is. And so simply defining it is a system of production and consumption focused on reuse and waste elimination. So again, two things that are important for you to remember is the circularity concept is really about two things, reuse and waste elimination. Right, so whenever you're thinking about circularity, you're going to be encountering those 2 points. So the circular economy really is when resources and materials are kept in use for as long as possible and then recovered, regenerated at the end of their service life. So think about any product. When you're thinking about that product, you're thinking about the resource that you used to build that product. You're thinking about how long can we use that product that we've just made, right? But not only how long can we use it for, how do we recover it and bring it back into the system? So with circularity, you're always thinking about reuse, elimination, and bring it back into the system. So circular design, which is, as designers, this is something that's really important for all of us here because we have the power. We are the ones to create these ideas and put them into place. So circular design refers to creation of products and services that no longer have a life cycle with a beginning, middle, and the end, right? They contribute less waste, and they can actually add value to the ecosystem. So the reason why I put a design responsibility in brackets is because it's our responsibility. With circularity, and I'll explain that in the next slide, it's something that can only happen with a level of consciousness when you decide from the very beginning. So when you're creating a product, you have to have thought about the end from the beginning. You can't create a product that doesn't have an end-of-life strategy, essentially. So it's our responsibility. It's not something that we leave to someone else. We decide it on our own. If a product or service is truly circular, it will never actually have an end to its life. It will continuously take a new form. So at the end of its life, you've already programmed it to come back into the system, to start at the beginning all over again, and I'll give you examples of how that's possible. Mapping this journey will ensure that your product stays in a useful state for as long as possible. So again, I put mapping this journey in bold because it is something, again, that we're going to have to figure out from the beginning. So you're going to have to plan your process from the very beginning. So how do we stop waste from being produced in the first place? So remember I said reuse and waste elimination are two things that are extremely important. So how do we stop waste from being produced in the first place, right? In a circular economy, waste doesn't exist. Everything is an input for another cycle of value creation. Waste is a design flaw. Now, this statement, waste is a design flaw, is something, I don't even know who came up with this quote, but it's something that is like a mantra from something that I follow very closely. I discovered it in 2020 during the pandemic. And I've obviously been working in circularity for a while, but I never really considered, I was always thinking, okay, how do we eliminate waste? But I wasn't really thinking about it from the perspective that waste in itself is a mistake. So it's a flaw. It's not supposed to be there in the design process, right? And we've been trained as designers to encourage waste. It's a part of the process. When I talk to designers, I remember having a conversation with a designer about some workshops, some waste workshops that we're trying to implement. And I was saying to her that, well, on the cutting, I don't know any of you here that are tailors or not tailors or designers or work with tailors, when you're in the cutting room, you're cutting and there's a lot of waste and there's a lot of fabric and excess everywhere. And I said to her, well, do you know that there's something called zero waste design, and that means that you can cut without any offcuts or at least minimum offcuts. And she's like, no, it's not possible, it's normal. It's normal for you to have offcuts. And we were having this conversation because for her, she just couldn't understand how she can cut freehand or with a pattern and not have any of the excess pieces. Now, those excess pieces is what I'm talking about. That's what I'm saying is a design flaw, right? So From a waste perspective, we understand that there is no waste in nature, that waste is actually a result of design choices. We can decide on our own from the very beginning to not include waste in the process. So before we talk about return, in the natural order of things, when we're designing in the natural flow, there's no waste. It doesn't exist, right? So if there's waste in the process, it means that there's something off somewhere. There's something wrong. So if you keep that at the back of your mind, it's something that will help you design, because as you're trying to follow circularity and eliminate waste from the process, you start to realize that waste is a flaw. And so if you're trying to design waste out of the system, from the beginning, if you're already aware of that, then it's easier for you to make decisions that aren't waste related, right? So when we're thinking about, that leads me to talk about this concept of return. So the idea of what is return, right? With circularity, you hear people always talking about return. What does that mean? So this is a quote by someone I really like called Mei Ling Loco. She's an architect, a Filipino-Ghanaian architect. And she says, the biggest problem with our economic system is that we are constantly extracting value from our land, our ecology, all to make and scale these commodity products that we never really think about how to return back to the ecology or the land. So return is about linking to the landfill. So thinking about the landfill and thinking about all the waste that's going there and the things that are coming out of our homes, our institutions, and how we bring that back, how we connect it back to some other parts of the value chain. So again, the concept of return is really about, at the end of a product's life, how do we make sure that that product has a new life, right? So again, it's talking about this idea of waste. So if waste doesn't exist, that means that the product's end life has a new life, right? And so it's this idea of moving away from the linear economy of we're making something, we're using it, we're throwing it in the landfill. We forget that the landfill, if it's not biodegradable, it stays there for 100 years. Who's responsible for that? Whose livelihood will be affected by that waste in the landfill? So it's really about thinking about the products that we're making, the products that we're consuming, because it is a consumption issue as well, an overconsumption issue. Thinking about the products that we're making, the products that we are consuming, and thinking about how do we return it back to the land? How do we return it back to the ecology? So this, again, is a butterfly diagram. It's what they call it. Again, from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. And it's really simple because, and I'll share with you two important things about circularity. So circularity really is about, there are two elements of circularity, right? And it's the biological element and the technical element. Now, with this, the two things I want you to look at the top with this diagram is production and use, right? So you see the landfill is at the bottom. You create something and you use it, but then you see the arrows are going back in. So it's a circle. So everything is always being used and produced, but it must go back in, right? So let's look at the technical cycle first. So the technical cycle is things like metals, plastics, things that cannot biodegrade. What is biodegrade? It simply means that things that can't decompose, things that can't go back into the ground, to the soil, on its own naturally or within a controlled environment. Think about phones, cars, even some clothing, maybe for example made with plastic. These things fit into the category of a technical cycle. So again, they should be kept in use for as long as possible at their highest value. Because you want to recover them and feed them back into the economy. Now, with the technical cycle, it's very interesting because let me give you some examples, some things that you can do. So let's take recycle, for example, right? You take an item, maybe like a plastic bottle, you recycle it, it gives you pellets. You can use those pellets and turn them into yarn and make a t-shirt from it, right? From these plastic bottles. There are a number of brands in the US that are using, for example, plastic bottles and plastic cups and turning them into t-shirts and sweaters, right? That's an example. Or you have remanufacture. Remanufacture essentially means making something again. So maybe taking a phone, pulling it apart, and putting it back together to make a different kind of phone, as an example. Repair, obviously, this is something that maybe we're already used to. You have a pair of jeans that's ripped, you give it to someone to fix, to tailor for you, to alter. Reuse, so again, I'm very good at pushing this idea of I wear my clothes. There's no such thing as I've worn it on for Instagram, I can't wear it again. It's important that not only are we encouraging people to wear what they have, but to reuse it in multiple ways for as long as possible. So that's not just clothing, but it's a product. It's anything that you have that can have a longer lifespan. Maintain is keeping something in the highest value for whatever that is, so that when you get to the end of its life, somebody else can use it and be happy with it, right? So you have a pair of shoes, you don't just wear them anyhow and throw them around, you keep them well and good enough so that if you want to sell them at the end of their life. Now with the resale market, for example, in the US, it's like $1 billion, it's huge, because what people are realizing is that they can invest in a product that they really like, but they don't have to hold on to it for 100 years. They can wear it for literally a year or two, resell it, and get their money back and invest in something else. There's also a sharing opportunity, right? This is another industry that's really growing as well, is this idea that, again, you don't have to own something for a long time. You can release it, you can share. We're sharing homes now, Airbnb. We're sharing cars, people are sharing clothing. People are renting out their clothing for people and they're making a lot of money. I was watching something the other day and this lady has made a lot of money from renting her clothes to people. So again, this is a new economy that we're living in, where people are aware of this idea of waste. Because in the past, people would just throw away their clothing that they didn't really care about. But now people are understanding that, first of all, there's money to be made in it, but it also helps the economy, the circular economy and the environment. And then the last thing, of course, is refurbishing. This is something that probably maybe some people already do. But for example, my mother's an interior decorator. And since I was young, she's been refurbishing her furniture. So the dining chairs that she has now is probably what she's had for the last 10 years. She just maybe changes the fabric, changes the paints, and it looks new every time. That's an example of the technical cycle. Now, for the biological cycle, what's interesting about this is that these items can biodegrade, right? They can go back to the soil. So food, waste, cotton, agricultural waste, for example. I'll give you a really good example of a brand that's using agricultural waste for textiles. They can biodegrade and return to the soil. They should also be kept in use for as long as possible, but they can be broken down. So it's not like a plastic bottle that if you leave it on the ground, it'll be there for 100 years. It can be broken down into the soil, into the environment. But with this, for example, so why I say recycling will require critical thinking from the onset is because, for example, if you have a cotton t-shirt and you merge that cotton with polyester, it's not going to break down. It's not going to be recycled at the end of its life because it's mixed with polyester, right? So you're going to have to think that if you want to recycle something at the end of its life, you're going to have to think about what it's mixed with. If, for example, you have a pair of jeans, it could be a pair of cotton jeans, but you've done some spray paint, chemical design on it, at the end of its life, it can be recycled to its highest value because it has chemicals in it that will alter the process, right? So these are things that we need to think about as designers from the very beginning. And then the most important thing, for me anyways, with the biological cycle, is that with the technical cycle where we are thinking about, okay, we don't want to waste, we want to limit the damage. With the biological cycle, we're not only limiting the damage, but we're restoring, right? Remember we said we're returning, we're bringing back to our ecology, we're bringing back to our land. So here we're, okay, limiting the damage and mitigating the damage and all that, but then we're also thinking about restoration. So we're all here, hopefully, in fashion. So big ideas for fashion, right? When it comes to clothing, let's explore circular economy within the context of fashion. So we've already said we're going to reduce waste. We're going to have a closed loop system, so a circle, right? For products that can be used for as long as possible. Conscious design is the most important thing. If there's anything that you start with here, think conscious. Think what are the most important things that I can create, that I can do, not only with the end of its life, but at the very beginning. So designing in a way that considers the environment, social and cultural impacts, creating products that are functional, beautiful, and mindful, being energy and water efficient, production. For example, I talked about the cutting floor, right? In your tailor's room, looking at the production process and understanding what that is. Now, the reason why I put functional, beautiful, and mindful is because sometimes people say to me, designers say to me, when I'm always encouraging them to to use circular textiles or sustainable textiles, they're like, oh, but it's not nice. It doesn't look nice. The fabric is not that exciting, you know? And so I think that with circularity, one of the most important things that I say to brands, just because you're sustainable and you're circular doesn't mean your brand has to be dull. It should be exciting. And I'm going to talk about that next, which is emotional durability, right? So people now are buying into your stories. They're buying into your designs. They're buying into your ethos. So just because you're using circular textiles and you're using sustain doesn't mean that it shouldn't be exciting. It should be nice. I'm not going to buy it just because it's a cotton. Even if it's a cotton shirt, it's an ugly cotton shirt, I don't want it, right? So as designers, we want to make beautiful products that encourage the customer to shop those items, right? But still feel comfortable about the fact that they're supporting a process that will be beneficial not just to them but to the environment. Again, this idea of sustainable materials for fashion is important. So prioritizing the use of materials that are organic, biodegradable, or have a lower environmental impact than conventional materials like polyester, for example, right? Some of you might have questions later about, well, what we have in Nigeria is only what we have, right? We'll talk about what some of the options are around access to local materials. Overconsumption, again, is this idea that, if it doesn't need to be made, do we need to make it? As designers, we need to really start asking our questions. Having worked with designers for a long time, I sometimes am sitting with brands as they're designing their collections, and they are creating pieces that they know are just for the runway. They won't sell, right? But as a creative myself, I'm a creative as well, and I understand the importance of creating some sort of excitement. But I think that there are ways that we can create excitement with purpose and with use. So I always encourage brands to ask the really tough questions. As much as I like this, is it necessary? Does it need to be made? How are we making things with intention? And I say tough questions because they are very hard questions to ask. It's not easy to say I'm not going to make this cute pink dress. But these are important questions that we need to ask as designers, and the power is in our hands. If we don't do it, no one else is going to do it. So giving the power, also, again, giving the power back to the consumer. Earlier on, I spoke about the customers being a part of the process. We had a conversation on Monday with the 3 laureates, and Eke, we'll talk about this later, but Eke was like, why is the responsibility always for the designers? Everybody, we need to kind of share the responsibility, and she's very right. But I think, I personally believe that designers hold the most power because we are the ones that create, right? But I think the customers also have the buying power to buy the better things, to buy things that make the most sense, to buy quality products, or to go into a store and refuse. For me personally, I guess because I've been working in circularity for a while, I'm very conscious of the kind of things that I buy. When I go into a store, the first thing I do is look at the label. It's just like when I go into a supermarket, the first thing I do is look at the ingredients on the back of, if it has all these preservatives and things, I'll just put it down. Same thing with clothes. If I see polyester, 8 out of 10 times, I'm going to put it down. And I think for me, I've trained my mind to be conscious in terms of what I buy. I want to buy better quality materials. And so it's a very difficult decision. Sometimes you see a really nice thing, and and not say that you can never buy polyester, but there's this argument about if you're buying something that's made from polyester, for example, ensuring that it's something that you can wear for a long time, and that at the end of its life, maybe someone else can wear it and it'll still be in good condition. I won't go into eco emissions and greenhouse gases and all those things because it's very complex. But again, being able to limit, one of the reasons why I encourage designers to source locally, and I know that, for example, Taju TJ, who they do that quite well, is they buy whatever is available, is because when you're shipping from across the world, it's actually problematic for the environment. But again, a big topic that it's like a 2-hour topic on its own. Then it gets into the hands of the customer. What's the customer doing with it? How long are they using it for? As we've said over and over and again, how long will they use it for? Are we producing something hoping that people like it and not even being sure that there's a value to it? And then once the customer is done, the most important part of the process. Can the material be reused? Can the product be reused? And can it re-enter the system, right? And we'll talk about that. I'll give very specific examples of how items can be reused and brought back into the system. Actually, I can give you some examples now. So for example, with, I think I mentioned before, like, cotton T-shirts. What I've seen some people doing, for example, the OR Foundation in Ghana does this really well, where they go into the market and they work with the local upcyclers, and they're taking all the waste that's coming from the global north, and they're turning them into different things, into fiberboard. So you can take a cotton T-shirt, for example, and cut it up into little pieces this T-shirt that no one wants anymore, and turn it into a fiberboard. So a fiberboard is like, a board made from fibers, right? It can be a tabletop. I've seen they did some tabletops, they did some chairs. And they're using very simple materials that we have, like cassava glue, which there's glue that comes from cassava. I didn't even know that until this summer. And they're merging that with cotton, and they're creating new products, tables, things that look like art. And so I think for me, one of the key things and the key takeaways that I want you guys to think about is, what life will my product have after? So this is, I mentioned earlier a company in Kenya that I wanted to share as an example of a closed loop system. So this is a textile company that just actually maybe even a year old. They're 3 university students. And they've already won 3 awards, the H&M Change Award, an IKEA award for this really great idea. But what they've done is they work with small farmers in Kenya, and they harvest these pineapple leaves from them, right? So at the very top, you see the pineapple leaves. They take them and they turn them into fibers. How do they do that? They have a fiber extraction machine. So they take the leaves and they extract them, and they turn them into what you can see hanging on the string, and they dry them after they've been sort of put through the machine. Then through a non-chemical process, they process those fibers. Now, obviously, we don't know what that process is because it's a trade secret, but we're sure that it doesn't use chemicals, which is something that's very important in, again, the way that we are creating circular products, is how do we eliminate chemicals from the process as much as possible. Then they take that, they comb it, they card it, then they turn it into a yarn, and then they weave it, just like we do ashoke, akwete, any kind of weaving. They weave it with cotton. And then the leftovers from the process at the top is then put back into the soil as nutrients for the pineapple leaves, which will grow again. So this is a full circle loop of how they're making this textile. So I think that, I thought that was really exciting. And what I love about this is that every process is completely thought through. There's no gap. Where I could possibly see the gaps is probably when the textile is being cut for fashion production. If they can figure out how to cut the textiles with zero waste techniques, then for me that's a 100% closed loop system. So again, another really great quote by someone that I really like. I met this summer, Jennifer Thompson from the company called Colorize. I think I mentioned companies, and there's a video, I don't know if we'll have time to watch it, but there's a video that I wanted us to watch where they pretty much talk about how they are building this dyeing system that does not basically uses maybe 1% water. Actually, the way that she describes it is that they dye with less water than in your toilet. Right, so anyone who has ever dyed here, I'm sure Eki knows, you use something called a dye bath. So you have a big pool of water, and you put the dye substance in there, and then that's kind of how you swish the fabric around in there. So again, as I mentioned earlier, water is a finite resource. From an innovation perspective, we want to create for example, if we're dyeing, we want to see how we can dye without water or how we can reuse the water, because otherwise what you're doing is continuously getting new water and throwing it out. And where are we even throwing out? We're not sure yet. So what she says is that there's this notion that sustainable products are less than, right? And I really like this quote because I'm really familiar with this when I talk to brands all the time, is that they always feel like they have to elevate it because it's not as exciting, doesn't look as nice, the fabric is not as moving. And that they're lacking in some sort of way. It's very true. They feel like they always have to give up something. They can't use their bright colors, they can't use their silks, they can't enjoy their lives in design. But what if sustainability, and for me I would add for the context of this, circularity was not lacking, but it was better than, right? And for me, the reason why I love this topic, something that excites me so much, is that it's better than, right? If you thought about it from the perspective that it's not that I'm giving up something, but I'm actually creating something of value that's even more exciting, it's better than. So now we're going into this idea of exploration in thought process and design, because as I said, consciousness and thought process is very important. So if you could redesign everything, what would you do differently, right? I'm sure I've said a number of things now, and you're probably thinking, okay, like if I had the opportunity to design, I would do things differently. So just ask yourself this, put this note down somewhere. What would you do differently? I already know, if I ever start a brand one day, I already know how I would do it, right? Because I would be thinking consciously. So let's go run through some thoughts. Okay, right? We would reframe our thinking, right? We would unlearn everything that we've been taught. So we've been taught to design a certain kind of way. We've been living with linear principles. Now we're learning to redesign back to source, right? We've learned that everything that we create must return to the land, must return to the soil, must have an end life, because really, when I say end life, there is no real end life because it comes back to the very beginning, right? So we're redesigning from the source and to the source. So from the source is being conscious, right? And deciding that at the very end of everything, you're starting from the beginning. So you're basically designing backwards. And you're asking yourself very tough questions, what will happen? Again, remember in the beginning we said, what happens to the end of the life of this product? What problems do we want to solve, right? So here I've mentioned a number of things, and I think one of the things that's key for me is that we begin to encourage brands, encourage creatives to go beyond design. I find that when people are interested in fashion, the first thing they want to do is be a designer. And I would encourage them not to be a designer. First of all, it's the hardest job to do, but also I think that there's so many more avenues, right? Today we've talked about dyeing solutions, we've talked about textile development, we've talked about reuse, we talked about sales, we've talked about service, right? Right now in Nigeria, I've been trying to push retailers and getting them to create opportunities for people to, sometimes I want to go out and I don't want to buy something, I want to wear something and return it. And so I've been trying to push retailers to consider this idea of this resale market, right? So it's something that, obviously, we already buy secondhand clothing, right? And the resale market locally is great. But the issue that I'm finding is that a lot of the clothes, and even in the markets, they'll tell you on roundabouts.com, roundaboutcommunity.com, we have a video which we did with the OR Foundation in Ghana where we kind of document when these bale sellers receive the bales. And first of all, because they have no access to what they're getting, pretty much is a surprise, right? And they're getting 80% of what they receive, they're not liking, they're not wearing, they're not wanting. But they're in the market, they're upcycling, they're being creative. But even with that, I find that with a lot of the imports coming in from China, we don't really have the same resale value. If you ask people that used to buy secondhand 10 years ago, they used to get really good quality things. Now, they are being, in Europe actually, what was actually interesting with the OR Foundation is that they actually took these bale sellers to Paris, and they took them into H&M, and they took them into Zara, and they realized that right there in the store, they're selling really bad quality clothing, brand new, right? So what they're getting from the onset is really bad. And so for me, I'm encouraging people to think about new solutions around circularity that's not just I want to make clothes. There's so many more opportunities for design, right? When I say design, it just means that it's something that we create ourselves. How do materials, people, and place take center stage? So earlier I spoke about the raw materials that we have access to, because we're constantly extracting, right? We're constantly extracting. We take raw materials from the ground and we don't put them back. So what do we expect? How do we expect the earth to regenerate? We need to make plans for putting back into the system. But who are the people, right? I think we do quite well in terms of our staff. For example, I think we don't pay, our staff, we're quite ethical. We don't pay our staff $1 a day and things like that. But really, the people that are making our pieces, that are in charge, like the artisans that are working with them, that are working with us, how do we treat them? Do we treat them properly? Are they part of our community of design? What is good design versus bad design? So good design for me is something that is conscious, with materials that are ethically produced, with natural materials and natural fibers that have an end life to it, versus bad, something that is maybe made with polyester or doesn't have an end of mind. Those t-shirts that we're talking about that you just want to throw away, that's for me bad design. What do we want to create and why? Again, as I said earlier, why? There has to be a purpose to why we create. How does it fit into a concept of circular design, right? So we talked about the fact that it has to be a loop that goes in and out. Does it fit into a circular design concept? Who benefits from it and how? Remember we talked about customers. Who benefits? Does the customer benefit? Does the brand benefit? Does the environment benefit? Does the ecology benefit? Does the land benefit? And how? And what can we make that can be reused and applied in different contexts? So for example, we said the t-shirt example that I told you that people are making it into fiber boards, right? And then the most important question to me is, how do we return? How do we innovate? So again, I was talking about innovation is very important to me because I think it's not enough for us to say we're circular as Africans. We need to push the boundaries. For me, what I'm really interested in is, for example, those guys in Kenya who have created a new textile with pineapple leaves, right? And we've also been doing some banana fiber experiments as well to just really play with this idea of agricultural waste. Agricultural waste is waste that comes from agriculture, right? And how do we take that? Because otherwise it gets thrown away and burnt, for example. But how do we take that and turn that into something else that benefits our land ecology, but also benefits us in fashion, right? Reimagining what is local. So thinking about the different textiles and the different ideas that we have locally. For example, I mentioned before our adire, our ashoke, and thinking about how, for example, imagine if we use those pineapple fibers and we wove our ashoke or our equated designs, that completely changes the game, right? What if we reimagined local dyes, for example, thinking about natural dyes and then using that for our adire, that also changes the game. Giving back to nature, something we've spoken about, humanizing and listening to raw materials. I love this concept of humanizing. So when you think about humanizing raw materials, it means like treating raw materials as a human being, right? Is this idea that raw materials have life to them. So what I found is when we're constantly extracting from the land, we have no real way to give back, but it's because we don't treat them, the raw materials, as if they have value. So if you begin to treat raw materials with value, you begin to use them in a way that's not only profitable, but better for the brand and better for the environment. So designing with materials first and not the product. So again, thinking about a dress that you're making and thinking less about the fact that it's a nice dress with a high slit, but more about the material. So for me, I always design material first, not product first. Because that way it changes the end life when you design the material first. As I said earlier, if the material isn't good at the end of the product, at the end of the product's life, it has no use for recycling, which is, again, the main, the most important thing. Guiding the chaos is something that a friend of mine, Nee, says all the time, is this idea of living in a space like Nigeria where there's so much chaos around us, but using that chaos for our benefit, thinking about the different infrastructural challenges that we have and finding opportunities to grow and to make changes from there. And then a tactile hands-on approach is essential, right? So being able to travel across Africa to see what else is available, being able to go into the markets and see what fabrics are available locally, being able to go to somewhere and look at the raw materials and thinking, what would this do? What can this do if I touch it, if I add this, if I do that? Like, just being able to use your hands to experiment and to explore. And then the last slide is really just certain touch points that I think are essential for our creative industry that I think we're lacking and I think can really help us as designers research. I find that designers don't research enough. You wake up one day and say you want to make a collection, but you haven't really thought about it. You haven't really designed it, right? You haven't gone online and done your research. You haven't spoken to people. You haven't gone into the markets. You haven't asked your parents. You haven't asked your friends. You haven't come to things like this. You haven't listened to case studies, right? So research is extremely important in how we develop our collections. Dialogue, conversations like today for me are exciting because we can, hopefully you guys have questions and we can really talk to one another and figure out, how do we create circular brands together? Exploration, again, being able to go from country to country and state to state within your financial limitations, of course, but being able to explore and see what's out there. Because sometimes I feel like we are very comfortable staying where we are. But I found that the brands that have done the most are the brands that go out of their circle. Knowledge sharing. This is something that's tricky because designers like to keep everything to their chest. They don't share. They're not, but I'm very adamant about saying that if we don't share, we will not grow. And I think that one of the reasons why our industry hasn't moved forward in the way that it should is because designers are scared to share and because designers feel that, if they share too much, someone will steal their ideas. But the progress that I've seen everywhere else comes from collaboration. It comes from sharing. It comes from partnership. It comes from, meeting 5 other designers and saying, can we share tailors? Can we share ideas? Can we share techniques? Can we share processes? Design labs, hopefully partnering with the government or creative bodies that can create spaces for designers to just test things out. In Europe, for example, there's funding for creative industry where literally you put a couple of people in a room where they have the space to just go crazy with ideas. And what comes out of that is things that can actually change the world, right? So those are the things that we need in Nigeria where people can, I'm sure a lot of us have creative ideas now, and then you're thinking, okay, she's saying all these great things, how do I get this done? This is where we can explore those ideas. Collaboration, again, is something that I said, with knowledge sharing is that a lot of the ideas that I've shared today with circularity, the primary thing that I will say about getting any of those things done is that you cannot do it alone. Don't even try. And if you try to do it by yourself, you won't get very far. So collaboration is extremely important. Finding people that you can partner with, finding people that you can share ideas with, finding people that can listen to you, that you can bounce back off, or that have strengths that you don't have and that you can work together. It's extremely important for the process to come to life. Access to materials, again, this goes back to design labs, right? Like being able to say, okay, I want to now create my own textiles in Nigeria. How do I do this? Where do I even start? And then the most important thing for me is as you're doing 1 to 7, document your process. I think, again, we don't document enough, right? So I was speaking to a dyer in South Africa early this year, and she was like, everything is in my head. I was like, this is not the age for everything is in my head. Everything has to be documented. Firstly, because people are coming after you that need to learn from you, right? Those Rethread Africa guys, they said they couldn't find anything on textile development in Africa. So they referenced a lot of people in China, right? Because those are the only people that they could find that had worked with agricultural waste in the past. And so as Africans, we have so much talent, we have so much expertise, we have so many skills, even in this room. I'm sure if we sat down and started talking, there would be so much. But the problem is that it's all in our heads. We aren't documenting, we're afraid to document. So I think it's really important for us to, as you're creating, thank God for the iPhone age, take pictures, document every step of the process, because not only will you be able to come back to it, but you can actually share that with someone else and it can actually help them. A lot of things that I've learned in my journeys because I've been able to reference things. For example, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation has been very crucial for my work, and that's because the information is open source, right? So a lot of it is free information that you sit and you spend time studying and learning. Thank you so much. You guys are really attentive.